Risk appetite. Glossary to the standards define risk appetite as the level of risk that an organization is willing to take. Simply put, it is the amount of risk that an organization is willing to assume in pursuit of its objectives. As we have discussed, it is the primary responsibility of the board to set appropriate risk appetite for an organization, and it is emphasized in Principle 7 of COSO ERM, which requires an organization to define risk appetite. It states that the organization defines risk appetite in the context of creating, preserving, and realizing value. Recall and relate the new 3 lines model, with its emphasis on creating value rather than just defending it. COSO ERM further elaborates that risk appetite provides guidance on the practices an organization is encouraged to pursue or not pursue. It sets the range of appropriate practices and guides risk-based decisions rather than specifying limits. Remember that COSO ERM is a principle-based framework. Most commonly, risk appetite is defined in the form of statements like, we have zero appetite for health and safety risks which result in fatalities, or we want to aggressively pursue growth opportunities in terms of innovation. There is usually a spectrum from low to high risk appetite, where areas such as compliance and health falling in low risk appetite spectrum, and growth and innovations are areas where organizations are more willing to take risks or willing to take more risks. For example, a startup may be willing to assume more risk in its pursuit of growth, whereas a hospital would have much less appetite for risk for safety and compliance risk. We should note that risk appetite is not static. It may or rather should change between products or business units and over time, in line with changing context and capabilities for managing risk. The types and amount of risk that an organization might consider acceptable can also change. For example, during good economic times, a successful and growing company may be more willing to accept certain downside risk than as compared to when economic times are bad and business outlooks deteriorate. Risk appetite must be flexible enough to adapt to changing business conditions because it is linked to an expected return, to moral values, or to business objectives, and because not all forms of risks are equally appetizing. The startup may have a large appetite for financial risks in its pursuit of growth, but the hospital would have very limited appetite for risks that could harm or kill employees or members of the public. Shell, for example, says, Goal Zero captures the belief that we can operate without fatalities or significant incidents despite the often difficult conditions in which we operate. Usually the CRO, that is the Chief Risk Officer, or any other senior officer monitors the risk climate, ensures compliance with regulations, sees that the firm operates within its risk appetite, and keeps the CEO and the board of directors well informed through established reporting processes. Risk tolerance. Risk appetite and tolerance go hand in hand. Risk appetite is usually a desire expressed in words. However, to fully translate that desire into decision making and actionable input at various levels, it needs to cascade through and align with other practices. Tolerance thresholds or tolerance limits/levels is how risk appetite is applied to specific objectives at a more granular level, including the ability to accept a risk, even temporarily, at a level above risk appetite. This is how we operationalize the risk appetite. Specific operational limits or optimum level of risk taking mostly expressed in quantitative terms. For example, a risk appetite statement might be that to ensure strategic alignment, we will limit business activities that are not consistent with our overall strategy and core competencies. And a suitable metric might be non-core investment capital should stay within a certain limit. So that tolerance threshold could be non-core capital ratio will not exceed 10%. Or we have a strongly adverse risk appetite for serious injuries, and the threshold would be maybe 2 serious injuries within a year depending on the type of business. Risk capacity. Risk capacity is the maximum amount of risk the entity can absorb in pursuit of strategy and business objectives. If risk appetite is very high, but the risk capacity for the organization is not large enough to withstand the potential impact of the related risks, the entity could fail. On the other hand, if the entity's risk capacity significantly exceeds its risk appetite, the organization may lose opportunities to add value for its stakeholders. See you in the next lesson.